the tragedy of the commons is concerned with the problem of allocation of resources. For religious reasons, many people want to adopt a motto like the one that Karl Marx expressed, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. In other words, the mere fact that you exist entitles you to your share of whatever there is that's around. Now, no other species of animal operates by this principle, and to think that human beings can do so safely is a very radical idea, and biologists don't think that they can. And as a matter of fact, the experiments that have been tried among human beings have shown that it doesn't work. For example, when you have a common pasture land and anybody who wants to can pasture his cattle on it, this works as long as there aren't many people. But as soon as there are many people, meaning many animals to be pastured, it turns out that people will put too many animals on the pasture, and if they're completely free to do what they want to, and finally you have to do either one of two things. Either you divide the pasture up into many different pieces of private property, and each person is responsible for his own, or you say, we'll manage this as a group, we'll appoint a manager, we'll pay him to manage this, and he will tell us how many cattle we can put on the land, and we have to do as he says. So it's either socialism or private property. Either one of those may work, but the unmanaged commons cannot possibly work once the population gets above a certain size.
That was Garrett Hardin explaining the tragedy of the commons, a phrase he coined and an argument that seems to pop up again and again. Before I get into examining it, I'd like to point out what some people see as the solution to this problem. The following clips are from the film The Corporation.
There are those who intend that one day everything will be owned by somebody. And we're not just talking goods here. We're talking human rights, human services, essential services for life, education, public health, social assistance, pensions, housing. We're also talking about the survival of the planet, the areas that we believe must be maintained in the commons or under common control, or we will collectively die. Water and air.
It sounds like you're advocating private ownership of every square inch of the planet.
Absolutely.
Every cubic foot of air, water.
It sounds outlandish to say we want to have the whole universe, the whole of the earth owned. That doesn't mean I want to have Joe Bloggs owning this square foot, but it means that the interests that are involved in that stream are owned by some group or by some people who have an interest in maintaining it. And that, you know, that is not such a loony idea. It's in fact the solution to a lot of these problems.
I will maintain that the market solution to these problems is loony. But let me get back to the argument as it's espoused by Hardin. The tragedy of the commons is actually an application of the tragedy of the free-for-all to the issue of the commons, that is, communally owned land. Resources that are free-for-all have all the problems associated with what is called the tragedy of the commons, namely the overuse and destruction of such resources. But unfortunately for the capitalists who refer to such examples, they do not involve true commons. The free-for-all land in such examples becomes depleted, the tragedy, because hypothetical shepherds each pursue their maximum individual gain without regard for their peers or the land. What is individually rational, when multiplied by each shepherd acting in isolation, ends up grossly irrational, ending the livelihood of every shepherd. What works for one cannot work as well for everyone in a given area. But as I will show, because such land is not communally managed, as true commons are, the so-called tragedy of the commons is actually an indictment of what is essentially laissez-faire capitalism. As Alan Engler points out, supporters of capitalism cite what they call the tragedy of the commons to explain the wanton plundering of forests, fish, and waterways. But common property is not the problem. When property was held in common by tribes, clans, and villages, people took no more than their share and respected the rights of others. They cared for common property and when necessary acted together to protect it against those who would damage it. Under capitalism, there is no common property. Public property, for example, is a form of private property, property owned by the government as a corporate citizen. Capitalism recognizes only private property and free-for-all property. Nobody is responsible for free-for-all property until someone claims it as his own. He then has a right to do with it as he pleases, a right that is uniquely capitalist. Unlike common or personal property, capitalist property is not valued for itself or for its utility. It is valued for the revenue it produces for its owner. If the capitalist owner can maximize his revenue by liquidating it, he has the right to do it. Therefore, as Colin Ward argues, local popular control is the surest way of avoiding the tragedy of the commons. Given that a social anarchist society is a communal, decentralized one, it will have little to fear from irrational overuse or abuse of communally owned and used resources. So the real problem is that a lot of economists and sociologists conflate the scenario in which unmanaged resources are free-for-all with the situation that prevailed in the use of commons, which were communally managed resources in villages and tribal communities. E.P. Thompson, for example, notes that Garrett Hardin was historically uninformed when he assumed that commons were pastures open to all. It is expected that each herdsman will try to keep as many cattle as possible on the commons. The commons, in fact, were managed by common agreement between those who used them. Similarly, those who argue that the experience of the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc show that common property leads to pollution and destruction of the resources also show a lack of awareness of what common property actually is. It's no coincidence that libertarian capitalists use such arguments. This is because the resources in question were not owned or managed in common. The fact that these countries were dictatorships excludes popular control of resources. Thus, the former Soviet Union did not, in fact, show the dangers of having commons. Rather, it showed the dangers of not subjecting those who control a resource to public control. And it's no coincidence the United States is far more polluted than Western Europe. In the United States, like the former Soviet Union, the controllers of resources are not subject to popular control and so pass pollution onto the public. We call them externalities. The Eastern Bloc shows the danger of state-owned resource use rather than commonly owned resource use, particularly when the state in question is not even under the even limited control of its subjects implied in representative democracy. This confusion has, of course, been used to justify the stealing of communal property by the rich and the state. The continued acceptance of this confusion in political debate is due to the utility of the theory for the rich and powerful, who have a vested interest in undermining pre-capitalist social forms and stealing communal resources. Therefore, most examples used to justify the tragedy of the commons are false examples, based on situations in which the underlying social context is radically different from that involved in using true commons. In reality, the tragedy of the commons comes about only after wealth and private property, backed by the state, starts to eat into and destroy communal life. This is well indicated by the fact that commons existed for thousands of years and only disappeared after the rise of capitalism and the powerful central state it requires had eroded communal values and traditions. Without the influence of wealth concentrations in the state, people get together and come to agreements over how to use communal resources and have been doing so for millennia. That was how the commons were managed. So the tragedy of the commons would be better called the tragedy of private property. Colin Ward points to a more contemporary example, that of Spain after the victory of Franco. The water history of Spain demonstrates that the tragedy of the commons is not the one identified by Garrett Hardin. Communal control developed an elaborate and sophisticated system of fair shares for all. The private property recommended by Hardin resulted in the selfish individualism that he thought was inevitable, with common access or in the lofty indifferences of the big landowners. As E.P. Thompson notes in an extensive investigation on this subject, the tragedy argument is that since resources held in common are not owned and protected by anyone, there is an inexorable economic logic that dooms them to overexploitation. Despite its common sense air, what it overlooks is that commoners themselves were not without common sense. Over time and over space, the users of commons have developed a rich variety of institutions and community sanctions which have effected restraints and stints upon use. As the old institutions lapsed, so they fed into a vacuum in which political influence, market forces, and popular assertion contested with each other without common rules. In practice, of course, both political influence and market forces are dominated by wealth. There were two occasions that dictated absolute precision, a trial at law and a process of enclosure. And both occasions favored those with power and purses against the little users. Popular assertion means little when the state enforces property rights in the interests of the wealthy. Ultimately, Parliament and law imposed capitalist definitions to exclusive property and land. The working class is only left alone to starve. In practice, the privatization of communal land has led to massive ecological destruction, while the possibility of free discussion and agreement are destroyed in the name of absolute property rights and the power and authority which goes with them. The real tragedy is the tragedy of private property. The absurd notion that these people who claim to own the land and the resources of this planet can do whatever they want with them. They can poison the air, poison the streams, and destroy the very system that we depend on for our lives.
Society, you're a crazy breed. I hope you're not lonely without me. Society,